The Forever Canadian petition drive looks to be a resounding success. The Alberta Teachers Association reacts to Bill 2. Plus, what next for the notwithstanding clause as a key case goes before the Supreme Court of Canada. All that straight ahead in this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Hey, folks, thanks for joining us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Appreciate you joining us. A lot to get to. It's been a busy week in Alberta. Of course, one of the big stories is the Alberta government's decision to legislate an end to the teachers' strike. Bill 2, which will force teachers back to work, will invoke the notwithstanding clause in order to do so. There will also be a contract imposed. The Alberta Teachers Association not happy, but we'll get their reaction, find out what their next steps might be. That's coming up shortly. Also, speaking of the notwithstanding clause, there's a key case going to the Supreme Court and an interesting intervention in that case from the federal government. So what does it all mean for the notwithstanding clause, the use of the notwithstanding clause? Is it possible that the courts could rein in put some parameters around the use of the notwithstanding clause, which would be interesting because it's there to give Parliament supremacy over the courts. And this was a key part of the Constitution negotiations that led to the Charter over 40 years ago. We'll talk about that case coming up later as well. I want to begin with the news, though, this week regarding the petition drive from the group Forever Canadian. Now, they had until October 28th to gather just under 300,000 signatures in their petition effort. And if you recall, this was a movement set out to counter the Alberta separatists. There's been a push to have a separatist referendum in Alberta. Now, the Alberta Prosperity Project has been pushing that on the separatist side. That matter is bogged down in the courts, though, because of the question as to whether that's constitutional. But the Forever Canadian petition effort was meant to flip that around. The question they were proposing is, do you agree that Alberta should remain a part of Canada? But what's also interesting is they weren't necessarily angling for a referendum on that question. Under Alberta's law that governs petitions and referendum campaigns, this kind of a petition would give the Premier the option of putting the question to the House, to MLAs in the Alberta legislature. MLAs could vote on this question, and that would suffice. Well, the deadline, as mentioned, October 28th, came and went, and by all accounts, it looks as though the Forever Canadian petition drive has been a huge success. Now, their goal was to get to 300,000, obviously, but at the same time, they wanted to give themselves a bit of a buffer, a bit of a cushion, because of all the specifics around this legislation and just how much all of these signatures are going to be scrutinized. It's possible some of these signatures could be thrown out. So if you're too close to the threshold, that kind of thing might put you below it. So they wanted to give themselves a bit of a cushion. But boy, oh boy, I don't know if anyone expected this. As it stands, based on their count and the signatures, all the documents they've handed over to Elections Alberta, 456,000 signatures, which I think is more than surpassed any of the expectations around how this petition drive would do. So it has turned into quite a movement. So what happens next? We're going to wait for Elections Alberta to certify this. The Premier's got some decisions to make. This could have real consequences for any other attempts to launch a petition drive to try to force a question on Alberta's place in Canada. So joining us to get into all of that, so very pleased to welcome back to the program the founder of Forever Canadian, by the way, forever-canadian.ca. Thomas Lukaszuk, of course, is a former cabinet minister and MLA here in Alberta, and he joins us on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Thomas, great to have you back with us here. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me, Rob. I appreciate it.
Okay, so as mentioned, there was this threshold. Again, it's the old threshold under Alberta's petition law. So it was just under 300,000 signatures your group needed to gather based on your count. And obviously this all needs to be verified. But what's the number that you believe you reached here?
We approached 460,000 signatures the moment we actually handed it in. So yes, enormous number of signatures, nearly 500,000 of electors. That just to put in perspective, that's about 25% of all the people that voted in the last election. So it's a pretty good threshold.
And again, just in case people aren't familiar with this process, this involved obviously getting out into the public. People had to sign these in person. There's all kinds of paperwork involved in this. I mean, it's boxes and boxes upon boxes that now have to go to Elections Alberta.
Yes, 62 boxes. So, if this was done online, we would have received a higher number of signatures. Probably you can double that at least. But this was pen and paper, nearly 6,000 volunteers across the province every day collecting signatures. So, quite an astonishing task to accomplish for those volunteers. But those boxes, 62 boxes, were delivered to Elections Alberta, containing all the signatures. Now, the commissioner hired a large number of Albertans who will be scrutinizing those signatures, making sure that they are electors, that everything is filled out properly. And he may discount some number of signatures, who knows? But we have enough of a threshold not to be concerned overly over that.
Mhm. Right, which was part of the goal, right? You didn't want to just
That's
get
right.
to 300,000 and maybe some signatures get thrown out or something. But it sounds like this process, we're not going to know, I guess, for sure until January, right?
Well, the commissioner has about 60 days to validate the petition, but I don't think he will take that long. Again, particularly because of the margin, but also he has other petitions on his hands now. We started something
Right.
here, so his office is preoccupied with two other petitions. I'm sure there will be more, so I think he will do it as expediently as he possibly can and as accurately as he possibly can.
Looking back at the decision to launch this campaign, kind of what prompted this on your part, and just everything that went into this sort of uncharted territory. No one had done this before, and just as you say, all the logistics, all the volunteers, everything that had to go into this. But where did this come from in the first place?
Well, when I started noticing that, we always have had some kind of a movement for separation, all the way from Premier Lougheed till now, and it would sort of rise and wane depending on the prices of oil or pipeline construction or something like this. But when I started noticing, for the first time in the history of our country, a premier starting to tilt the field in favor of separatism, that's when I decided that, somebody has to step in. When the premier amended the Citizens Initiative Act and lowered the threshold for separatists to only 172,000 signatures, extended the time period from 90 to 120 days, and basically took all the restrictions off of fundraising. And then when I learned that there is a deal that she will proclaim these new rules on July 4th, the American Independence Day, I knew something needs to be done immediately. And I had confidence in Albertans that I can actually get the signatures under the old rules, the more strenuous pathway. But that's what I did, and in essence, it was the right thing to do.
And there was some urgency to it, knowing that the separatist side was trying to organize their own petition campaign, because under the rules, getting there first is pretty significant.
It is. There cannot be two competing petitions at the same time. So by filing my first, even though under the less advantaged position of the old rules, was really critical, because then my petition, our question, would go forward as opposed to the separatist one. Having said that, they got stuck in court anyhow because their question is considered to be perhaps unconstitutional. The courts will decide, but that will be a lengthy process.
The response to this has been quite something. Obviously, the numbers speak for themselves, but even just to see, I know in recent weeks, Peter Guthrie, of course, former UCP cabinet minister who had been a supporter of Danielle Smith, he proudly signed this petition. I know Ed Stelmach was involved in this campaign. So it really kind of transcended, politics in a lot of ways, or at least the political aisle, didn't it?
In every way you can possibly think of, Rob. Our organizing committee had literally representatives of all political parties, not only provincial but federal ones too. We had former organizers of the Reform Party and members of Parliament and Liberals and Conservatives and NDPers and Alberta Party. And the list sort of goes on and on. But most of the people actually who were activated by this movement were people who were not politically active. They were engaged by voting, but not members of any political parties, and never actually imagined being part of a campaign. So this wasn't really a political campaign. This was a social uprising, in of a sense, where people started to reclaim and find their own voice. They particularly in rural Alberta, they were somewhat subdued into silence by sort of more vocal, aggressive members of the community, and they thought actually that they were the minority, and now they came to realize that they aren't the minority. They were just silent. They found their voice, they signed the petition, they got to know each other, A lot of friendships have been formed. So many refer to it as a movement or as a community. But it definitely was a healing process because neighbors who didn't trust other neighbors all of a sudden got to know each other. We're working together on this petition, signing the petition. After many years of divisiveness in this province, a lot of it purposefully created. This was a somewhat of a healing process, and I hope now that the premier does the right thing and allows this healing to continue, as opposed to call a referendum and again divide us again.
Well, we'll talk about next steps and what the Premier Cantor should do here. Just in terms of the movement itself, you wrote an op-ed a couple of weeks ago just talking about how people seem to be yearning for something positive in politics, right? That that maybe there's been too much negativity in politics. This gave something people could really latch on to, feel that positivity, almost that hope in a way.
Well, it showed that politics and campaigns can be done around a positive issue about something that you believe in as opposed to reject. It showed that it can be nonpartisan, that you and I may vote for different political parties, but on core values, we're the same. We're proud Canadians, proud Albertans, and we want this place to be as good as it possibly can be for everybody. So it rejected those old division lines. And I'm starting to notice this as I converse now with literally tens of thousands of people myself, that people are getting tired of this, of partisanship, and particularly this sort of left and right division. And they're asking and the reason they joined this was because they want something pragmatic. They don't care where it comes from, as long as it's good, as it's positive, as constructive. And they don't want to view politics anymore through the prism of what is left and what is right. But hope, hope was the biggest message. Thank you for giving us our voice back, and thank you for giving us hope. Because a lot of people even tuned out of news. They don't want to see what's going on around the world because it's all negative, and this was something positive. And I'm glad to have been able to share that with everybody.
At the same time, I mean, this isn't necessarily meant as an endorsement of the state of relations with Ottawa or an endorsement of federal policies or anything. And obviously, we can have disagreements with the federal government. We can have conversations about provincial responsibility and what's good and bad policy. How do you sort of separate all of that in this conversation?
So that's right. I'm hoping to meet with our prime minister soon and to discuss that, just because we got 500,000 nearly signatures doesn't mean that everything is perfect. Frankly, it never has been perfect. When I was in government, I was there under Liberal and Conservative federal government, and we always had differences with both. That's who we are. That's what Canada is all about. And that's what makes us so great, I think. It makes us a G7 country. We always are in flux. We negotiate things, but we have mechanisms for it. And we do it according to certain rules without threatening separatism. So the message will be things aren't perfect. Albertans are not 100% happy with the relationship that they have with Ottawa and with other provinces. And we need to negotiate those differences, but not using separatism as a threat. It's economically, it's suicidal. As we're arguing that we should be more prosperous, the whole threat of separatism is really undermining investor confidence in this province and in this country. It shows cracks that others are exploiting for their political gain abroad. It's simply not a wise thing to do.
So in terms of what happens next, and one aspect to this whole campaign that maybe people don't fully understand is the type of question that you drafted under this legislation and the different options that the premier has. This doesn't necessarily have to mean a referendum. In fact, you've been pretty clear that this shouldn't mean a referendum.
Correct. So that's why I chose a different pathway from separatists. Separatists filed under the constitutional clause, which would give premier or government no choice. There would have to be a referendum that would be binding on the government. Again, that's overreach. We don't need that. We know where most Albertans are. So my pathway creates an extra step. It gives the premier, the government, the opportunity to do what I consider to be the right thing to do. So the premier, once she receives this petition certified, she never, by the way, gets to see any signatures. She just gets a certificate. Right. Signatures get destroyed like ballots. Once she gets the certificate, she will strike a committee. But majority of the members of that committee will be her caucus UCP members. So basically, she will tell the committee to give her advice that she really wants to receive. And that committee will give her two options. One is to bring this question to the legislature and have our MLAs vote on it. And if it passes, which I have no doubt it would overwhelmingly pass, that would become government policy. And this talk of separatism would be done and over with, and government would be able to focus on other important issues of the day. And we know that there are many of them right now. Or Premier can choose the wrong thing to do, maybe more politically expedient for her, but definitely the wrong thing to do for Albertans and for our economy. And that is to call a referendum, either a standalone referendum or with the next election, which would again divide Albertans against Albertans, would create this uncertainty because we would have a massive campaign for at least probably 6 months. Yes, no campaign like they had in Quebec. And we know what happens to investment then. When we all know, when 500,000 people sign a petition in less than 90 days, when all polling shows that more than 80% of Albertans want nothing to do with separatism, it would be an unconscionable thing to do. But the ball is in the Premier's court. She can do whichever she wishes.
But I guess she has to choose a path. Like she can't ignore this, right?
No, she cannot ignore this. She has to act on it either way before or at the next election. And, from a political perspective, I think any premier would be unwise to ignore 500,000 Albertans from the entire province. What's interesting here, Rob, is that, I will be pulling out more statistics because this campaign was very much IT/AI based. Interestingly enough, I believe that on per capita basis, we collected as many signatures in rural Alberta as we did in urban Alberta. So the same percentage of residents signed this petition. So there is no urban-rural divide when it comes to our wanting to stay in Canada and being patriotic.
I don't imagine you've spoken with the Premier at all.
No. The Premier has made comments about this petition, but she and I are not conversing at all.
Do you foresee the possibility? I mean, she would still have to do something, I guess, at some point. But what about a snap election to sort of avoid making a tough decision here?
Well, no, she has to call a referendum on or before the next election. So if she calls a snap election, then this referendum will be part of that snap election. I certainly, hope she does the right thing. And let's, we elect MLAs to make difficult decisions. This isn't a particularly difficult decision when, this petition and polling otherwise shows you where you're at. Have a vote in the legislature and let's put this separatist talk to bed once and for all. And then let's focus on curing some of the issues, because I don't dismiss the fact that there are angry Albertans who maybe have been driven to the point of wanting to separate because certain issues bother them so much. Now, I had the opportunity to speak to many of them as I was traveling in that Unity bus. Put on over 7,000 kilometers, believe it or not, in a month and a half. And some of their issues are valid, but rather nearly impossible to solve because Harper had the same issues he couldn't solve either. The number of seats that Alberta has in the House of Commons. Well, we can add seats to Alberta, but that means opening up the Constitution, and then other provinces will have their asks too. So sometimes you better not opening that can of worms. Maybe electoral reform is the way to go. If the equalization formula needs to be looked at, let's take a look at it. But again, be careful what you ask for, because other provinces will have their asks too. So sometimes opening up the Constitution is a risk that we would take. And those are the discussions we need to have, and there are mechanisms for these discussions, and nobody dismisses any of the legitimate complaints that Albertans have. But unfortunately, a lot of this was charged by emotion and purposeful disinformation, backed by massive dollars. Rob, I don't know where these dollars are coming from, but when I have a farmer telling me that he doesn't need access to Tidewater because he will be flying his grain out of Alberta. Even me, a city slicker, I know that there's zero possibility, physically impossible. And people are starting to buy into these mythologies, what an oasis this country of Alberta would be if they could only be a separate country. And we need to engage with those people into a conversation as well. And somehow convey the message that, it just doesn't add up. Facts don't support that theory. somebody's playing you, and is capitalizing on your dissatisfaction for some other other gain.
Now, and again, as you mentioned, the rules are pretty clear that there can really only be one petition on a certain issue. So, I mean, as you say, the ball's in the Premier's court in terms of the decision she makes. But once this is certified, regardless of her decision, that closes the door on any other petition around this question, doesn't it?
That is correct. It closes the door. But if she decides to go the referendum path, we're ready. One of the reasons why it was also important to go first is to make sure that we just don't stand on sidelines, watch others organize. But now we have 500,000 signatories. We have 6,000 full-time canvassers, and that's that's what Forever Canadian is all about. It has only one purpose: to make sure that Albertans remain in Canada.
What about your own future? I mean, as we mentioned, you were previously in politics, of course, for quite some time. You've been away for a while. I mean, is this maybe for you an avenue back into politics? I know we mentioned Peter Guthrie, potentially the rebirth of the PC party. Where do you see your future from here?
This has never been part of the calculation, so I honestly haven't given this a lot of thought. I was simply focused on this one task, although I have to, tell you that I'm asked that question a lot now. I never thought politics would be again in my future. I'm quite happy being out of politics and being a little bit of an armchair critic and organizing these campaigns like this one or the Ukraine one a few years ago. I don't know. I really honestly have to tell you, I don't know. I never thought I would return to politics. It's once you've done it for as long as I have, almost 15 years, but never say never. I'm not a member of any political party in Canada. I haven't been for now nearly 10 years. I don't have a political home right now in Alberta because even though I lent my vote once to NDP, I'm not a NDPer, nor am I definitely a UCPer. So I'm not sure, what formations there will be into the future, but I'm not also involved with this movement of recreating the PC party. I simply haven't had time to even pay any attention to that.
All right. Well, an opportunity to take a deep breath here. We'll await to the final word from Elections Alberta and I guess see what the Premier decides to do. So again, Forever-Canadian is the website. Thomas Lukaszuk, again, congrats and thank you so much for joining us here.
Rob, thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
Okay, so there you go. Thomas Lukaszuk, founder of Forever Canadian, of course, former MLA and cabinet minister here in Alberta, and probably not heard the last of him. I'm not sure if there's a return to politics in his future or what next for the Forever Canadian movement. As he says, if there is going to be a referendum, well, they'll be there, just as they were in this campaign, fighting for a united Canada. But we'll have to wait a bit to see what's going to happen next. Elections Alberta is going to take their time with this. And understandably, this is quite an effort, given the hundreds of thousands of signatures to go through here. But assuming this is certified, maybe we'll know by January, maybe sooner, the Premier of Alberta has a decision to make. Is Danielle Smith going to put this to a referendum? That's one option. But as Thomas Lukaszuk says, it's not the only option here. There is the option of putting this to a vote in the Alberta legislature, letting MLAs vote on this question, and that could potentially be that. And given that this petition would have succeeded, it would preclude any other petitions on Alberta's future in Canada from coming forward. So that would more or less end this conversation. But is that going to sit well with everybody? Do we need a referendum just to get it out there, let Albertans have a say and maybe move on from this or put it behind us? What are the risks of there being a referendum, even if it's on the Forever Canadian group's question? And if Danielle Smith doesn't put this to a referendum, what are the political consequences for her? There certainly is separatist sentiment within the UCP base. And I think there's a real fear that she has that if she alienates those folks, what could that mean? Could that mean the rise of a separatist party that poses a real threat to her? Could it even mean a threat within the party, a threat to her leadership? So I'm sure that's something else that would weigh heavily on her mind. Now, going to a snap election wouldn't make all of those choices go away, but maybe it would be an opportunity for Danielle Smith to lay out what she wants to do in this area and and let Albertans have a direct say. So it's going to be very interesting to see what comes of all of this. But again, a pretty resounding success, this petition drive by the group Forever Canadian. Coming up in a second, we'll talk about the other big news in Alberta this week. Bill 2, tabled Monday in the Alberta legislature and basically rammed through in very short order, which forces teachers back to work, ends the teachers' strike, gets the kids back in the classroom, imposes a contract on teachers, uses the notwithstanding clause to try to shield this from any kind of legal challenge. So, yes, it ends the strike. I don't think it ends all of this tension and disagreement. But we'll get some reaction from the Alberta Teachers Association in just a second here on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, of course, this week the Alberta government has tabled Bill 2, the Back to School Act, which legislates an end to the teachers' strike, invoking the notwithstanding clause in the process, and also imposing a contract on teachers, along with some hefty fines for anyone that might defy this back to work order. So joining us for some reaction and next steps here, Jason Schilling, president of the Alberta Teachers Association. Jason, thanks for making some time for us here.
You bet. Thank you for having me on today. Appreciate it.
We kind of knew that this was coming, or something like this was coming. The government had telegraphed a willingness to use back to work legislation. But still, what surprised you about Bill 2 this week?
Well, there's a couple of things that I find extremely concerning, and I hope that most Albertans do as well. The first is the fact that they had pushed this through the legislature in one evening. So they had suspended the rules that we normally would have in our democracy of how a bill would go through the House. Time for debate, time for the public to see it, time for feedback to be given. But they surpassed all of that and just pushed it through in one evening. Now, the bill itself uses the notwithstanding clause, which strips away teachers' charter rights around a variety of things. That is a gross overstep by government in a situation where they could have simply returned to the bargaining table and tried to find a solution that way.
On the contract side, and maybe there was some expectation, maybe there would be some kind of arbitration, binding arbitration even potentially. But to impose a contract, and not only that, impose the contract terms that the teachers had overwhelmingly rejected, what kind of message does that send?
Well, I think it's a message that they didn't actually want to listen to what teachers had to say about the issues that we had brought to the table. They found a solution that they were comfortable with, and they wanted to move that forward and not negotiate things like a student-teacher ratio or to look at maybe an increase of the salary portion to reflect the fact that teachers had taken stagnant wages over the last decade and were looking to make up on some lost inflation. So to me, they use this legislation as sort of an easy way out of trying to get out of a difficult negotiation situation.
So where do things stand here on Wednesday? I guess, first of all, I mean, are schools now reopened? Are teachers back in the classroom? What's happening across the province now?
Yeah, school's open today. Teachers are back at work today. But I'll tell you right now, they are not happy. Right. They feel disrespected. They feel demoralized that the government would take this draconian step on putting this legislation in place with the notwithstanding clause. But I also know that a lot of them are resolved to keep fighting. You can't silence teachers. They will use their voice. We saw it over the last 3 weeks at rallies and walks and demonstrations all over the place. We know the things that we need to see in our classrooms to make them better for not only themselves, but for students. And we won't be silenced by this.
What do you feel the strike accomplished? Because now that the Alberta government has cut it short, they've imposed these terms, do you still feel like it was worth it? Did it accomplish anything?
Well, it accomplished a couple of things. So, for instance, government has now recognized that they need to collect class size data. They stopped doing it in 2019. One of the things coming out of the strike is that they're going to start collecting class size data again this November. And so we will make sure that they do that and the other promises that they made in terms of a task force. There's also an aggression task or study group, or I can't remember the name of it, action team, I think they called it, who has they have some recommendations that should be out here shortly. So we're going to make sure that they follow through on those recommendations and that they fund them. We also know that teachers turned the conversation around public education. They flipped the switch essentially in this province, that everybody knows about public education and the things that teachers are going through in their schools. And you can't turn that switch off. They've awakened quite a few people to the issues. And from what I'm seeing on social media, they don't plan on stopping using their voices either.
what recourse does the ATA have? I mean, the various aspects of Bill 2 are meant to kind of, I think, cut off those options. The contract is imposed, so there's no need for negotiations as the government would see it. The notwithstanding clause, I guess, is meant to cut off any route through the courts. So where does that leave your association?
Well, we'll still launch legal challenges towards this bill and towards the use of the notwithstanding clause. We're not shy about doing that. So we will pursue legal means. Having just had the bill for a day or two now, we still have a little bit of work to do on that and just what that exactly will look like. But we also still will maintain the work that we do as an association in terms of advocacy, in terms of making sure that we're not the least funded school jurisdiction in all of Canada. And one of the next big targets that we need to look at is when budget 2026 comes down in February. Are we still going to be the least funded, or has government actually listened to teachers, parents, and students across this province saying enough is enough, you need to do better?
Well, given that, there are some wage increases and changes to the grid included in this contract that's being imposed, are teachers better off now than they were a couple of months ago? Or what do we make of some of those aspects?
Well, we know with the salary increase that was imposed on teachers, this was what the government's sort of mandate was in terms of financials. You've seen other unions accept the 12/4 with a grid adjustment as well. So teachers were looking for something that was a little bit better because we'd only seen a 5.75% increase in the last 10 years, but inflation's been close to 30. And they were looking for more. This is a starting point. Next time we negotiate with a unified grid, you're able to make better gains with that. So we'll have to just see where things go after this.
In terms of any other possible labor action, and I know, the strike is disruptive, and there is going to be some catching up to do here, which is going to mean heavy workload on teachers. But is a work to rule campaign or something along those lines a possibility? Is that on the table?
Well, work to rule is technically a legal strike action. If we were to do work to rule, it would be a legal job action, and then we would be subjected to the fines, as you had noted, are quite hefty within the bill. I mean, this bill is structured to really keep teachers down in that regard. And so moving forward, teachers will make decisions, though, about how they use their voluntary time. They might not run a book club at lunch. They might not coach cross country or something like that. They've got their own decisions to make about their own time that they volunteer at schools beyond what their professional responsibilities are.
And longer term, that relationship between the Alberta government and Alberta teachers, especially when we need to retain teachers, we need to recruit teachers. What does this approach from the government do to that relationship?
Well, the relationship obviously is broken at this point, and we'll have to do some work to try to fix that. But it's a good point in terms of if I was living in another province, would I want to move to Alberta and become a teacher? And that's something that the government has created this mess with in terms of using the notwithstanding clause in Bill 2. They keep saying Alberta's calling, come live here. It's the great Alberta advantage. Unless you're a teacher, you don't get that advantage. You don't get to have all of your charter rights, and we'll impose a settlement on you. People will want to become teachers because they love the job and it's a calling. And we will continue to work as an association to improve the state of our schools so that teachers want to stay there.
So with the public pressure and the public attention that is on this issue, with the Alberta government now vowing to collect class size data, the expectation that Albertans have that these issues get addressed, are you still hopeful that despite kind of the frustration of the darkness, the dark cloud of Bill 2 this week, that there can be some improvements when it comes to education in Alberta?
We will definitely be holding the government to its words and their feet to the fire through the next couple of weeks to see if they actually fulfill the promises that they made. And I would encourage the public to do so as well, parents to do so. This government has said, we'll do the following things to address the issues that teachers see in schools. Well, let's hold them to account. And if they're not, then we need to hold them to account at the ballot box in 2027.
All right, well, we'll see where this all goes from here. Much more at teachers.ab.ca. Jason, appreciate the update, and thanks for spending a bit of time with us here.
Yep, you bet. Thanks very much.
Okay, once again, Jason Schilling, president of the Alberta Teachers Association, their reaction to Bill 2. They're not happy, clearly, and we'll see what they choose to do. Somewhat limited options, given the way that Bill 2 has been designed and written, with the notwithstanding clause, with the fines for disregarding this back-to-work order. Now, there's also the question of what other unions might do. This has not gone over well with other labor groups and unions. I mean, I guess at some level you can understand why. If the notwithstanding clause can be used to stop a strike for teachers, where else could that be used? What does it mean for the right to strike or collective bargaining rights? So we'll see if this turns into anything broader on that front. Other unions going on strike or some kind of general strike with public sector unions or others. So that's not something that Jason Schilling and the Alberta Teachers Association can speak to, obviously, but I think that threat is also still there. The Alberta government's clearly banking on people moving on from this. You know, we've seen polls that suggest that there's a lot of sympathy in Alberta for the teachers and the concerns that they've raised. There's some concern with how the Alberta government has handled this. This approach in Bill 2 might come across as too heavy-handed. But again, I think the Alberta government's going to just hope here that now that the kids are back in school, teachers are back to work, this will kind of fade from the headlines. We'll move on to other issues. Now, they do still have the opportunity, as we talked about with Jason, to address some of these issues that I think people are concerned about. Class sizes, classroom complexity, per-student funding, building more schools. And if they're able to figure out a way to do that, again, that might alleviate a lot of these issues and a lot of these political pressures. But look, I mean, Alberta is facing a tough financial fiscal situation right now. So that's something else to consider. We'll see where this all goes from here, but I don't think this debate is over. Now, speaking of the notwithstanding clause, that's been a real focus as of late. So the timing of Bill 2 is kind of interesting in light of the broader conversation happening around the use of the notwithstanding clause and how that fits into the Charter. It is a part of the Charter, of course, but it is also there to override parts of the Charter. Now, there's a case going to the Supreme Court of Canada and an interesting intervention from the federal government on this case that could potentially put some limits or some further parameters around the use of the notwithstanding clause. So we're going to hear from one constitutional expert about what this could all mean. A couple other interesting cases, too, I wanted to touch on with Dwight Newman from the University of Saskatchewan. That's next on the Rob Breakenridge Show. All right, well, joining us to talk more about an important upcoming case around the notwithstanding clause before the Supreme Court of Canada, also a significant decision in BC regarding Aboriginal title rights. Very pleased to welcome to the program here Dwight Newman. He's a professor of law at the University of Saskatchewan, Canada Research Chair in Rights, Communities, and Constitutional Law. Professor Newman, so great to have you with us here.
Well, I'm glad to join with you on this.
Interesting timing this week. Now, the Alberta government is invoking the notwithstanding clause in the, to bring about an end to the teachers' strike here in Alberta. But there has been a lot of conversation about the use of the notwithstanding clause, whether there should be limits around the use of the notwithstanding clause. What do we need to know about this, first of all? This is Section 33 of the Charter, correct?
Right. So, I mean, just to put that context on, Section 33 of the Charter says that governments in Canada, the federal government or the provincial governments, can make laws operate notwithstanding, so despite the presence in the Charter of Section 2 or Sections 7 through 15 of the Charter, which are actually many of the very important rights. Section 2 is all of the fundamental freedoms, and Section 7 is life, liberty, and security of the person. 8 through 14 are the criminal justice rights, and Section 15 is the equality rights. And so governments can actually pass laws that operate despite those sections of the Charter if they have a different perspective on what's appropriate compared to what the courts might otherwise say.
Mm-hmm. And this was an important point in the negotiations around the Charter, and I guess it's about the principle of parliamentary supremacy. Then, why is it in there?
So it was included as something distinctively Canadian to strike a bit of a balance between a full American-style Bill of Rights with courts enforcing that and the old parliamentary supremacy model of Britain, which of course was part of Canada's history. And so we adopted a Charter of Rights where judges often review legislation and make decisions, and parliaments or legislatures follow those. But sometimes parliaments and legislatures can make the final decisions on controversial issues and offer their own perspective on what rights imply or what limits there are on rights.
Mhm. So this isn't new. We've had the charter, we've had the notwithstanding clause for more than 40 years. What's your sense then of why this has become more of an issue more recently?
So there have been a few periods where there was more use of the notwithstanding clause. One of them early on was Quebec. Immediately after the adoption of the charter, there were some special reasons for that in terms of Quebec not being fully included in the final constitutional deal. And then we went through a period with occasional uses of the notwithstanding clause by some provinces, but then a lengthy period where there hadn't been uses of it. And there was almost a taboo that had developed around it. But that changed in recent years, in the last decade roughly, um, going back to about 2017. And I think part of it is that there's developed an increased skepticism by a number of provinces about the direction in which some judicial interpretations have gone, and they had some different perspectives on what charter rights should lead to. And the first use in this recent wave of uses was from the province of Saskatchewan with a trial court judge who was going to strike down some arrangements around faith-based schools in Saskatchewan in the context of the denominational school system. Um, and the province of Saskatchewan announced that in order to protect minority religious schools, in essence, they would end up using the notwithstanding clause. And that gave parents and children a lot of stability around their decisions on schooling. As it turned out, Saskatchewan won in the Court of Appeal and didn't need to actually um, proclaim and to force that law. But they had gone through and adopted the legislation to clear the way for it. And then since then, a number of provinces have made uses of the notwithstanding clause over recent years. I mean, some of those, frankly, we could attribute a little bit to culture war type issues that are pretty controversial. Um, Others are in response to court decisions where courts have gone in directions that nobody maybe envisioned at the time of the adoption of the charter, where there continue to be disagreements with the way the courts have gone on those.
Mhm.
And for example, the adoption of a right to strike, something that the Supreme Court of Canada rejected through its early decisions, but then changed in the last decade or so and said there's a constitutional right to strike. Well, the province of Alberta, in its recent decision, has said, well, in the special context of their solemn decision about this back to work legislation, that they're actually going to protect it from a challenge that could otherwise be put on that basis as part of the legislative decision that they're making.
Right, which has been described as preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause. Is there any difference, I guess, in legal or constitutional significance? Do we differentiate between a preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause versus using it in response to an actual court decision?
So traditionally, I would have said that no, nobody thinks there's a difference between those. In recent years, there have emerged a number of arguments um, by those that are seeking to have the courts put new restrictions on the use of the notwithstanding clause, where people are arguing, well, the courts should prevent parliament or legislatures from making preemptive uses of the notwithstanding clause. In the history of the uses of it in Canada, a lot of the uses have actually been so-called preemptive uses before a court decision, or they're after a trial decision, so they're preemptive in the sense you didn't argue things all the way through to the Supreme Court of Canada before using it. But indeed, many have been before any court decision at all on the basis of what legislators anticipated would be the decision of a court or could be the decision of a court simply to safeguard the legislation. Saskatchewan in the 1980s made a use in the context of back to work legislation before they knew whether the Supreme Court of Canada was going to say there was a constitutional right to strike. At that time, ultimately, the Supreme Court of Canada said no, there wasn't. But Saskatchewan, in resolving a particularly contentious strike, had decided they wanted to safeguard the legislation to make sure that there wasn't a constitutional challenge that would suddenly reverse the decision or that would pose questions about it. And so, on one of those rare instances where it has been used in that context. Saskatchewan made that use preemptively, and there have been many preemptive uses of it. But it is something that some are now saying, well, courts should have a chance to pronounce on this, to provide information to voters, something along those lines. And two courts of appeal have recently said different things on that question. So the Quebec Court of Appeal in the Bill 21 case that's soon to be heard at the Supreme Court of Canada said there's no restriction on preemptive uses. The Saskatchewan Court of Appeal, in a more recent decision concerning Saskatchewan's use of the clause on pronouns legislation in schools, ended up saying that they think that a 4-to-1 majority of the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal said that courts can actually rule on cases even after there's been a preemptive use. They didn't prohibit a preemptive use, but there's been this different decision about what courts do in the context of a preemptive use, and that they might still rule on the case even while accepting that the notwithstanding clause is validly used. So I'm mixing two issues a little bit there. Some are arguing that there just shouldn't be a preemptive use possible, and then some are arguing that if there's a preemptive use, courts should still go ahead and rule on the question, even if their decision won't have an immediate practical effect.
Right. So this case, Hawk versus Quebec, going to the Supreme Court, and there's that question of, well, why is this going to the Supreme Court? What does the court have to add? This is Quebec's Bill 21, the secularism law, which does seem to infringe on freedom of religion rights, but Quebec has used the notwithstanding clause. So why isn't that the end of the story? What is there for the Supreme Court to add here?
There may be very little for the Supreme Court of Canada to add if they stick with their existing precedents on the notwithstanding clause. But some have argued that there should be extra restrictions on the notwithstanding clause, so the court needs to rule on that argument. In addition to that, I should be clear, there may be aspects of Quebec's law, limited aspects of it, that are outside the scope of the notwithstanding clause, and that's been one of the issues as it's worked its way upwards. To the extent that it's making decisions about minority language schools, for example, there are charter provisions about those that aren't subject to the notwithstanding clause, and so there might be something that's outside the scope of the notwithstanding clause, and the Supreme Court of Canada will have to clarify whether all of the law survives based on the notwithstanding clause, or whether there might be small pieces of it that are affected by those sections of the charter outside the notwithstanding clause. And they also need to rule on these arguments for changes, essentially, in the court's precedent on the notwithstanding clause.
Right. And is that what the federal government is asking for? I think their intervention in this case did seem to raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, I think their argument does raise some eyebrows. Certainly, the federal government has put a very interesting factum forward with their written argument, and they'll end up putting that in oral argument as well, where they've tried to create a new category or a new conceptual category of situations where the use of the notwithstanding clause would permanently destroy a right, or this is sort of how they describe it. So they think there are some contexts in which the court should say the notwithstanding clause can't be used, even though it would look like from the legal text that it could be. So they're posing a question about sort of the structure of the Constitution as a whole, and trying to argue that there are some additional restrictions on the notwithstanding clause that the courts haven't pronounced upon as yet. We'll see where that argument goes, but it's a particularly dramatic argument in some ways, because I don't think people were necessarily expecting the federal government to be coming in and putting an argument for these kinds of additional restrictions on the notwithstanding clause, and
Right.
That's what they ended up filing.
Well, I mean, if they wanted that, I suppose, we could reopen the Constitution and try to change it that way. I don't know if there's an appetite for that. But otherwise, I mean, it almost feels like at some level there is a bit of an inherent contradiction here, given the purpose of the notwithstanding clause, to then have the court say, well, but yeah, you can only use it this way, or we're going to rein in or constrict how it be used.
Indeed. I mean, it's in some ways a clause designed to put certain decisions outside the purview of the courts. And if the courts are going to review the decisions to put a decision outside the purview of the courts, it becomes a bit of a strange situation in terms of the role of the institutions. And to my mind, that's the key thing to remember, is that the notwithstanding clause is a rule about the role of different institutions in making decisions. And one might or might not like a particular use of the notwithstanding clause, but it's there as what institution gets to make a decision. You might or might not like the decision of a court on a particular case where a court has the clear authority to make that decision. We don't get rid of courts as a consequence. And similarly, liking or not liking a particular use of the notwithstanding clause isn't really a reason to get rid of the notwithstanding clause, as people sometimes end up saying.
Right. Well, we'll see what comes of that case. I did want to ask you about this ruling in BC, the BC Supreme Court. Maybe this is something also headed to Canada's Supreme Court, but a potentially significant decision with regard to Aboriginal title rights. And I know BC is unique in not having the treaties that, say, Alberta or Saskatchewan does, but all of a sudden now this ruling has called into question some property ownership rights for some BC residents. What do we need to know about this case?
Yeah, so just to be clear, British Columbia has a different naming convention on its courts. And so the British Columbia Supreme Court is the trial court in British Columbia, the equivalent of the Court of King's Bench in Alberta or Saskatchewan. Well, this was a very lengthy trial that took place, 500 trial days, a claim by the Cowichan, who are normally thought of as located on Vancouver Island, for an area of Aboriginal, for an area they claimed under Aboriginal title on the mainland side of things, and as it turned out, actually an area of urban land in the city of Richmond. Now, they were claiming, in principle, just federally owned land in that area, and also land owned by the city of Richmond. And they said they weren't claiming against any of the private landowners in the area covered by their Aboriginal title claim. So earlier in the proceedings, the judge ended up saying, well, there was no reason to give notice to the private landowners because their land wasn't being claimed under the case. As it turned out, some of the city of Richmond's land was owned in what's called fee simple, which is the same kind of land ownership arrangement that private landowners have. And so as a result, the court ended up pronouncing on the interaction of Aboriginal title as a doctrine of law and fee simple ownership, and ended up saying that Aboriginal title actually takes priority over fee simple, and that the Land Titles Act in British Columbia, which tries to protect the security of land tenure, can't prevail over Aboriginal title. And these statements, and while saying that the decision has no direct effect on privately owned land, the decision at the same time says these things that actually open up the potential for First Nations with Aboriginal title claims to claim privately owned land. The judge says, well, there could be other arguments put. And I think one of those that could be put would be a defense of what's called a bona fide purchaser for value, which is basically somebody innocently paying money to buy land and acquiring it on that basis without realizing there's a prior claim. Well, that is a situation that's very much protected by the courts in a lot of property law contexts. Whether that could prevail, though, against a constitutionalized claim to Aboriginal title is a debatable point. And so what happens with it if a First Nation did actually seek to claim privately owned land? There becomes an implication from this case that they could well be successful. So it puts a level of uncertainty over privately owned land in much of British Columbia, which, as you referenced, is largely without the kinds of treaties that we think about in Alberta or Saskatchewan.
Well, I guess further complicating all of this, there were some other First Nations, I understand, that were making competing claims here. So there's a lot for the court to try to sort through. What sort of precedent are we potentially establishing here?
Yeah, I mean the competing claims were partly about some fishing rights issues in the case that understandably aren't getting a lot of attention in the public discussion on it, but will be an extra thing in the appeal process that helps to slow down clarification of the case because there are a lot of issues to address. But there was also an issue: did the Cowichan specifically have, at the time of the assertion of European sovereignty, sufficient and exclusive occupation of the lands that they were claiming? And the competing claim by the Musqueam and or Tsawwassen could end up being that there wasn't exclusive occupation by the Cowichan. The Cowichan ended up trying to put forth a lot of evidence that even though they used this land only seasonally, that other times of the year, other First Nations were scared to enter into that land because the Cowichan had a very fearsome reputation. And this is all sort of there in the evidence that the court heard over these 500 trial days, and some really tough factual issues for the court to try to sort through. That aspect of the case around the law on an Aboriginal title claim, aside from the privately owned land issue, I don't think it marks a big change in the law, but it represents a complex application of the law to facts. And I guess in the context of other competing claims in other cases, courts would have to go through similar exercises to try to sort through which they thought had the better claim as to whether there was exclusive occupation or not.
So in the aftermath, and again, this may be appealed. We'll see what other courts say. But how much uncertainty does this ruling create, do you think?
Oh, it creates a significant degree of uncertainty at the moment, because it's difficult to forecast exactly what Court of Appeal is going to say or what the Supreme Court of Canada would ultimately say if it makes its way up there. Mm-hmm. I've tended to say that people shouldn't panic just yet because courts try to do reasonable things, and courts aren't in the business of rushing to oust people from their homes. But I mean, this particular decision almost reads like a court would. And so understandably, people have significant anxiety around the decision, but there is an appeal process to go through. And this issue of privately owned land hasn't been tested out in this particular way as yet. We may get a bit more indication this fall. It's expected the New Brunswick Court of Appeal will end up ruling in a case with some related kinds of issues, a case called the Wolastoqey case, where there's a claim to privately owned lands. And so we'll get a gradual sense, but that's not necessarily good enough. I mean, the city of Richmond sent out a letter warning everyone in the Aboriginal title area that there are new uncertainties attached to their titles. One might as well send it out more broadly in British Columbia in some ways at a sort of a more moderated level because there hasn't been a decision elsewhere as yet. But I guess the letter led to a large public meeting at which people came and expressed their concerns. And there have even been some indications that some may be facing difficulties getting mortgage financing or renewing mortgage financing or insurance because of the uncertainty cast over their titles now. And if we see that just in the period of uncertainty about this, that's going to be really problematic, given the length of time the appellate process could take.
Indeed. Well, some important cases to watch closely. We'll leave it there for now. Professor Newman, really appreciate your insight on all of this. Thanks again for making some time for us here.
Sure. Happy to do it.
Okay, so some great insight there from Dwight Newman, again, professor of law at the University of Saskatchewan, also Canada Research Chair in Rights, Communities, and Constitutional Law. So the notwithstanding clause case going to the Supreme Court of Canada, that's going to be one to watch. And we'll see what happens with the appeals and the fallout from this Aboriginal titles case in British Columbia. Some pretty potentially big ramifications there. That's where we got to leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Again, you can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, our YouTube channel at Rob Breakenridge Show. Thanks so much for spending some time with us here today. We will talk to you next week. Take care.